Joining us today is Dr. Jason Gulya, a professor of English and Communications at Berkeley College and a leading architect of human-centric AI pedagogy. A self-described embracer of technology who challenges the transactional product mindset of traditional schooling, Jason advocates for a radical pivot toward process, messiness, and human deep learning. He's the co-author of Artificial Intelligence, Real Literacy, and the voice behind the AI Adventure newsletter. Jason's here to help us navigate how higher education can bridge the digital canyon and why the future of work belongs to those who master durable skills alongside their AI co-pilots. We hope you enjoy this discussion with Dr. Jason Gulya. Thanks so much for joining us, Jason. It's great to have you here with us. And Stefan sends his regards. He's unfortunately out sick today, so he was really sorry to miss this conversation. He sent me a bunch of questions and had a lot that he wanted to hear about, but we certainly hope to have you on a follow-up, and I'm going to get to that in a couple minutes. And so hopefully you'll be part of that discussion a little bit later.
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about kind of your background and working in this area. And, we know that you've been very involved with the study of AI in education, really from the beginning, starting to integrate teaching about AI in your coursework, working with other faculty, working on LinkedIn conversations, presentations at universities. Tell us, what are some of the larger trends you're seeing with how professors, and maybe even particularly English professors, are relating to and working with AI?
Yeah, I think that we are starting to see kind of a shift. I think that really since ChatGPT came out, focus has really been about academic integrity, cheating, and I think that that's sort of how it's moment. And I think there are still, right, according to one survey, it's about 48% of faculty are still using AI detectors to cut down on it. But I do think we are slowly starting to see the needle move, so that more and more faculty are interested, not even just how to use these programs, I think that's part of it, but also what the larger implications are. And that's one of the things that really I find very interesting. When I go and I train faculty at a college or university, and they ask me questions about what does this mean for the classroom? What does this mean with how I relate to my students? What does this mean for assessment? And those are the conversations that I really want to have. And at Berkeley College, I'm a professor of the humanities and English and also communications. And so I do think that we're, even in my department, starting to see that shift happen. And I think that that can be a very positive thing. When I go and I talk to the faculty at my institution or at other institutions, I think that we're starting to see AI have less and less just inherent gravity in it. That now, there used to be this focus that it was always the center of conversation. That's still sort of there, but I'm starting to see more of an interest in the AI and something, AI and assessment, AI and, the relational education, or whatever the focus is. And that's where I think the trend is going. Seeing AI have less and less gravity, and we're sort of hopeful about this, and we're starting to talk about hopefully having bigger conversations about what this means for colleges, what it means for classrooms, what it means for skill acquisition, all that sort of stuff. So that's where I see the trend going, and I'm hoping to continue to nudge it in that direction if I can.
So it sounds like that conversation is kind of maturing. We're getting to the stage where it's not just the shiny object, but it's more about, okay, now what do we do about this? How do we integrate it or react to it in different areas?
And this is where I think a degree of AI fatigue can be useful. Ever since, for the 2 or 3 first couple of years where ChatGPT was widely available, I think that AI was the center of every conversation. And I've noticed, even over the last year or so, a really dramatic increase in just AI fatigue. And I will have students come in and tell me, I'm tired of talking about AI. I just want to talk about the course content. I don't want to talk about ChatGPT anymore. And there are ways that can be a negative thing. It kind of pushes it aside and it makes it harder to engage with it. But in some ways, it's a positive thing because it allows us to start looking past the technology, looking at the changes that have already happened in the classroom and society at large. I do think that there's a great truth in thinking about generative AI as a cultural technology that's already started to shift the way that we learn, the way that we think, and the way that we engage with the world. And I think that now those conversations are coming into view a little bit more, precisely because AI fatigue has set in for so many of us. And we don't want to talk about just ChatGPT anymore. We want to think about other things and think about the broader implications. conversations. So I think that's one way in which I've been sort of surprised by the positive side of just being tired of this technology in some ways.
Now, you mentioned students feeling some of that AI fatigue. What other trends do you see with students? Are they kind of mirroring what you're finding with faculty and administrators, where they're starting to integrate it? It's not the shiny object the same way anymore. They're thinking about it in different ways.
I think the mixture of student perspectives is one of the hardest things to deal with in the classroom. And at my college, we just started our term last week. This is our second week of the semester. And whenever I go in, I talk to my students about it. We address it head on. We talk about what they already know about it. And some of them know a lot. Some of them use it every day, actually may know a little bit about AI agents, maybe using AI assisted browsers or AI-powered browsers. And then other students know virtually nothing about it, or have just been told not to touch it. And that's it, right? That was the end of the conversation. And I think that the mixture of levels of experience and attitudes towards technology is so difficult that I think that we underestimate how hard it is to walk into a classroom with, say, 20 students. And you might have 5 students who know the technology really, really well, 5 students who know it a little bit, 5 students who've never heard of it, who've never heard of ChatGPT. Yes, they still exist. Yes, they're still going to college classrooms. Yeah. And then 5 students who know a lot about it and are absolutely opposed to touching it for ethical reasons, for environmental reasons. And we have to teach all of them, right? We have to bring them into this shared space. And that's one of the reasons that I really tried to go in and personalize the learning as much as I can, so that when students are completing their project for whatever course it is, I try to give them a great deal of agency over the degree to which AI is a part of their process. As I do want to create an inclusive environment. I want to bring in those different perspectives. I do require using AI to a certain extent for certain assignments, just as I think it's helpful to have an informed opinion about it. But for the bigger projects, I try to give students as much agency as I can. And I think that my suspicion, I don't have the data on this, but my suspicion is that probably reflects what's going on with faculty. The percentages might be different one way or another, but my guess is that if you go into a room with 20 faculty, you might find a very, very similar combination. And I think that there is a way in which students are mirroring the way that faculty talk about it. And sometimes, a faculty member will have embedded AI in their class. Students are having that perspective. They're going to another class and AI is banned, right? Whatever that means, however that's enforced. And then another class, they'll have just kind of sort of be in the middle. And then so I think that it's sort of natural to mirror from a student's perspective. What faculty are doing is you get these different perspectives and different class policies that are built around those perspectives.
Yeah, it's a bit of a minefield that we're asking students to navigate as they're figuring out, okay, Anand likes it, Jason's okay with it, Stefan really doesn't like it. How do I handle this in different situations? Yeah. I think you're experiencing something with students that I've experienced as well. And they're a fairly vocal minority that are very opposed to using AI, feel that it encroaches on their creativity, their thinking skills, and they're fairly thoughtful about this. And I really appreciate that skeptical perspective coming in. But what do we do as we go forward and we start to talk about integrating AI? And you mentioned in your class that there's some that you do require some use of AI. Just because you think it's useful. If we're developing a curriculum where we think it's important that students learn how to use AI because we think they're going to have to use it in an AI world, how do we negotiate that with students going forward?
I think a lot of it, at least for me, comes down to the specific uses we have built into our classroom. And I try to be very upfront with my students about, if I have them do an exercise with AI. So one of the forms that I really like, especially for an online asynchronous class, is I will use AI to put pressure on students. So what I might do is I might give them a reading, maybe an article, maybe a poem, maybe a story, whatever it is. And especially in online class, I might give them that reading, ask them to annotate it. So we use Canvas so they can do an individual annotation, or I offload it to Google Docs if I want to do a social annotation and I want them to, mark up the text, write things down. This is something that's very, very difficult to use with a large language model. Students can do it with an agent if they know about that. It's not AI proof by any means, but it is an engaging way to get them to read the text and take a look at it. And I also did this with the course syllabus last week. So I can do it with course material. And so I'll have students mark up a text, and then I might give them a custom chatbot. And often these are designed to put pressure on them. So I might create a debate chatbot for students, right? And say, especially if it's a text that's open access, that's online and freely available, I can actually give it that text and ask it to take a perspective different from the students and put pressure on them. And I have them send me the entire transcript. And so in that context, I actually think AI can be very, very useful when we're thinking about putting pressure on students and really holding them accountable to doing the reading. And it can actually, at least for me in that particular use case, can boost critical thinking and can boost reading comprehension and just presentation. And I know now there are tools, so the way that I do it, because it's just what's freely available to me, I use PlayLab, so it's all text-based. And then now I'm seeing more and more tools that are audio-based, so they can actually talk to a chatbot and that can generate, an assessment or a transcript or whatever it is. Whenever I do that, whenever I give a use case like that to my students, I try to talk about why. One of my default positions now is that one of the best things we can do on an everyday basis, almost every assignment basis, is talk about why we're doing something. And I was reading an article a few days ago, it was published by Mike Kentz, and he has a framework for thinking about, using AI. I'm going to mess up his formulation a little bit. It's still clear in my head. But, using AI as a butler was one of the ideas, right? So you have a really domain knowledge and you're just using it to fetch something, right? I know how to evaluate. I know how to look at it. I just want you to get it from me so that I can do X, Y, and Z with it. Then the one that I don't use that too much in the classroom, especially for students if it's a course that's focusing on foundational skills. But the other formulation he has is using as so he has a thinking out loud partner, which sometimes I use. But one of the ones I use more frequently than anything else is as a sparrer, right? That the student is like fighting with them and pushing against them. And I find that, this is the debate bot, right, is a version of this. And I will tell students, and I actually might do this explicitly this week, I might give them Mike Ketz's formulation of it and say, we're using it this way. Here's why, because we're using it to acquire skills. We're using to put pressure on ourselves and kind of challenge ourselves. And I'm hoping by doing that I'm also nudging my students towards just learning more AI literacy and making it clear that something like ChatGPT, many people use it still now as a search engine, as a butler, go get me something. Yeah. But in fact, one of the best use cases for education, which is weird because it's very anti-efficiency, is as a sparrer or as a thinking partner. And so I try to front load that with my students and just talk about why we're doing that. And that has helped, being very clear with the purpose of it. For me, that's my default position with just how to adapt in the age of AI, right? Yeah. Front load purpose, front load how it helps us with learning, focus more on that and a little bit less on quote unquote AI proofing things. I think it's going to get harder and harder to do that as we go forward, and agents and everything else become more freely available and more readily available.
That's excellent. Giving students that understanding allows for better buy-in. At the very least, even if they're still going to say, "Hey, I'm still skeptical. I'm not excited about it." At least I understand why you're doing this for the class, and I see a potential benefit for it. I think that's a great framework. Now, I know that you also serve on your institution's AI committee. I think you chair that as well, right?
Yeah, it's the AI and Academic Integrity Committee.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So what are some of the things the committee's been working on, especially when we're thinking about academic integrity? You mentioned some faculty still wanting to use AI detection tools. I'm certainly against that and really worried about what that might mean within the classroom. But tell us a little bit about your take on this and what do you do with the committee?
One of the big projects this last year was revamping our entire academic integrity policy. And part of it was, because we have our stipulations that have been around for, 10 plus years. That was the last time it was ever really revamped. And so the challenge was trying to figure out, when looking at ChatGPT and other AI technologies, what could just be a subset of that? What could be in a bullet point? So for example, one of the stipulations in our policy was that if a faculty member thinks that a student misused a program or cheated, step number one, and this has been in place for 10 plus years, step number one, before failing anyone, before reporting them is to talk to the student. That was not something we had to create. I was actually sort of surprised, right, when I actually look at the academic integrity policy, and it was very clear. Step number 1 is you schedule a Zoom or you schedule an in-person meeting. You talk to the student before doing X, Y, and Z, and certainly before we start to escalate it. And so I actually felt like that's something we don't actually have to change. That we can keep as is. We can put, using ChatGPT or other AI technologies under there, and that's cool. And so that was one thing we had to do. For other parts, we had to start to really sort of revamp it, right? Try to figure out maybe using generative AI from a student perspective and a faculty perspective has broader implications. So, for example, we had to create a policy for figuring out how we're going to approach AI detectors. And this was the challenge. This was where, at least last year, I'd be curious if I had to redo it, if I'd get the same friction points. Yeah. My suspicion says no, but I could be wrong. But one of the big friction points was how faculty are using AI detectors. And sometimes, and I'm very open with this, if anyone from my institution is listening to this, I am very open about this. One of the questions I got was, I'm using Turnitin's AI detector. At what percentage exactly can I fail the student and not be questioned and have the college back me up? Yeah. And that is a question that I got a lot. And they were, right, very much clearly, they were looking for, a 53%, whatever that threshold is. And so we had to be very purposeful when we were on the committee to, one, say that's not possible. And that's where, some people were not happy with me. That is, first of all, it's impossible to say what that threshold is. And also, that's a bad way to use the technology, right? We cannot agree on a percentage, and we cannot offload this judgment, right? That, even if we use an AI detector, and I have many friends who still use them. I don't myself. It doesn't really fit in my classroom. It doesn't create the culture I want. And so I have reasons for not doing that. But I have faculty members who do, friends who do use it and have a much more purposeful orientation towards it, right? They will go and check things. They will go and they have a whole process, right? A mosaic model. So my friends Chris Ostro does this and Anna Mills does this, right? I disagree with them, but they do have a more purposeful approach towards it. And so actually, one of the things that we did was I sort of used some of their models and I revised it and we worked it into our academic integrity policy. And we were very clear. And we said that, if a faculty member thinks that a student misused or abuses technology and cheated, step number 1, they have to meet with the student. That's unchanged. And then step number 2, if the only evidence you have is the score on Turnitin, right? That's your primary form of evidence. We are going to throw out in 5 seconds. It's not going to win. The student will win that appeal, right? That is not enough. We cannot take that as gospel. Now, if you think you have a portfolio of evidence saying, oh, I think the student misuses technology, then we can have that conversation. And it was very tricky for me to figure out where that boundary was, especially thinking about, if it does happen to escalate. But that was challenging, trying to figure out, where the hard things were. So trying to say, no, we're not going to agree on a percentage. We're not going to use the technology this way. And the big challenge here is academic freedom, right? I believe in academic freedom. I believe in faculty members being able to design the learning cultures that they think best serves their discipline, what they're trying to teach, the skills they want students to acquire. But we also need to have an agreed upon set of things. And it's very, very hard when you're creating an academic integrity policy around AI or that's AI informed. It's hard to strike that balance because for us, if I'm a faculty member, I'm teaching 5 classes at once, they're all in the same discipline, right? They all have a kind of commonality, but students are moving back and forth, right? They're going from their calculus class to their literature class to their chem class and all these different policies. So from a student perspective, we need to have these agreed upon things, especially, just in terms of academic integrity procedure. And that's always one of the challenges. Now, probably this year, I don't think we'll have to fully revamp it, but probably do more tweaks along the way. And that's one of the things too. I tried to make it clear to, the administration at my college that we always will have to relook at that academic integrity policy. We can't let it sit for 5-10 years, right? We're going to have to look at it every year. And sometimes it's probably not a full revamp, but it's going to need to be tweaked. We're going to have to redirect it and things like that. And that's not been the case. It's always been assumed that you could revamp your academic integrity policy in 2025. We'll look at it in 2035, right? It's not, You can't do that anymore.
Yeah. What's interesting about it is that while the committee is really focused on academic integrity, I think there's so many of the processes there that you've outlined that are very similar to other AI committees that faculty might be serving on other campuses. And that experience of negotiating that, getting the pushback from colleagues and others saying, no, I want to be able to use this tool, or I want to be able to use it this way, or have this policy. This might be the thorniest aspect of it. When we're talking about academic integrity, it's central to so much of what we do as faculty members, but it really does mirror so many of those other interactions. If you think about it that way, and it's beyond AI and academic integrity, but really just AI policy on campus. Yeah. What advice would you give to a faculty member serving on one of those committees, or maybe starting one of those committees on their campus? How do they get that buy-in and develop that kind of community sense of understanding about AI?
My biggest piece of advice, which I wish I had a year ago, was to try to get really good when talking about AI and academic integrity at shifting perspectives. One of the issues that I came across against a lot is that, when we think about academic integrity, our lens is student facing. What does a violation of academic integrity look like from a student perspective? And I think that one of the best things we can do is to expand that and say, well, students can use it for blank, can't use it for blank, whatever they are, whatever those boundaries are. But what about faculty? And this is something I want to lean into a little bit more and take my own advice, right? Because we have faculty doing all sorts of things as well, right? Creating worksheets, creating lesson plans. We might have faculty who are auto-grading, right? Who are using ChatGPT to give, whether it's a one and done grade and that's it, not questioning it, or hopefully a first pass grade that then they revise or reject or whatever it is. We have faculty doing that. And so you don't have to necessarily work that into an academic integrity policy, but I do recommend having it in the background because that's going to help you. Even if it's just, here's the boundary, right? Here's why they're different. Here's why, say, a faculty member can AI generate something, but a student cannot. Why? Mm-hmm. For some, that seems hypocritical. It doesn't have to be, right? Yeah. But you have to be clear about why we're making that distinction. Is it learning? Is it skill acquisition? The faculty already has those skills the student is working on. Okay, whatever that reason is, work that in, because I do think that it helps having it there. And then the other big perspective change for me, and I ran into a personal experience when I got some pushback with this. After, so we had been working on the academic integrity policy for a couple months. And at a moment I was talking to faculty and I said, well, the academic integrity policy feels very negative. It feels we're automatically about violation, escalation, all that stuff. And I said, it felt so negative. What would it be like to look at it from a more positive definition of academic integrity? And so my experience has been when you mention that, you immediately get pushback. You immediately and I understand why. I understand where that's coming from, right? Are we trying to just make us all feel better about this? We're going to allow student cheating, whatever. And so what I ended up doing was I said, all right, we had that conversation. People weren't necessarily happy with me. I said, all right, what I'm going to do, I'm going to rewrite the first two paragraphs of the academic integrity policy with a positive lens. And I'm going to send it out. I'm going to say, this is what it looks like. And we had to vote, right? And 100% of the faculty voted for the positive lens. Wow. There wasn't even, I expected it to be 50, 50-50 or 60-40 or whatever, one way or another. But then it was oh no, this is better. We should do this, right? And I think that's another piece of advice, right? Shifting that sort of perspective and just being able to give a model. And there are a lot of them out there, right? This is a positive definition of academic integrity. This is what it looks like. Obviously, we want that negative, that we want the violation aspect and everything like that worked in there, but we can reframe it a different way. And just one of the obstacles, and this is not limited to academic integrity conversations, is that, especially in higher ed, we are so used to thinking about something in a certain way. It's embedded in our culture. We think about grading a certain way. We think about academic integrity a certain way. And one of the best things we can do if we're, trying to diplomatically push things along is to just give other ways, right? This is another way of doing it. Yeah. Let's talk about that. And that's, members of your committee to also shift their perspective. It's challenging, but I think it's helpful to say, well, this is what I'm talking about. Here's an example. And I wish I knew that early on to just do that repeatedly, because I think it would have made my life easier.
And outside of AI, that would be a really helpful technique because you're right. As faculty members, as open-minded as we try to be, we become fairly dogmatic in our practice,
Yeah.
and it's difficult to break out of that. If you've been specializing in something for decades, and that's where our expertise comes from, it's sometimes hard to view that other perspective. And that's great advice. That actually leads me to another question I wanted to talk a little bit about in terms of some of the changing needs. And this is difficult as a faculty member. I've told the story that I'm teaching a class this semester, argumentation, that I remember teaching the first time when I was a graduate student in 1992. I've been teaching this class for over 30 years. And I have to think very consciously about how that has evolved. Some elements have stayed the same. Perhaps the ones that are probably bound in millennia's worth of literature and research, right? But there are other aspects of it, of course, that need to change because of the changing needs of students and the way technology interacts. We talk about how AI changes how we need to teach. I want to ask you a little bit about what we don't talk about, and that's also changing what we need to teach. When you think about your own experience and following developments in AI, do you have any broad thoughts on how AI is changing what students need to learn?
It's really interesting because I do think that one of the needles that I've seen move especially over the last year, maybe year and a half, is I think that after ChatGPT came out in November 2023, for the first year, I think that there's a lot of, resistance to anyone teaching AI literacy, right? Just keep it out of the classroom. Don't even talk about it. And that perspective is still there. I'm not going to belittle that perspective. I do think it is gradually becoming the minority perspective. That when I talk to faculty at my institution and elsewhere, there's this understanding that AI literacy or fluency, whatever you want to call it, needs to be a skill that students have. Now, what hasn't moved, the needle that hasn't moved, is who's going to teach that. I don't think there's an agreed upon perspective of who is going to teach that particular skill. Now, obviously, if we're talking about an AI class, and I teach one of them, I teach AI-powered communication at my college and a couple other ones that are more AI-centered, we can say, all right, well, clearly it's going to be taught in that class. I think that there is this ongoing conversation about beyond that, who should be teaching this? I think that the original move was to kind of put it on English and writing departments and say, AI, ChatGPT is having a pretty immediate effect on writing studies. You teach it. You do it. And some faculty took that on. Some of my friends took that on and said, all right, this is what that looks like in my discipline. And then other faculty said, nope, not me. Someone else is going to do it, right? Somewhere along the way, hopefully, our college students get a sense of how to do that, how to work with AI, what the implications are. It's not going to be in my class. And I think that one of the things that we need to do is we need to start really contextualizing terms like, AI literacy. I think that AI literacy, AI fluency, and everything else have been offered as kind of these big umbrella concepts. But one of the things that I'm starting to see departments grapple with is the way that we talk about AI literacy from a literature perspective, or from a writing perspective, might be very different. Maybe there is something disciplinary about that conversation. And that's what I think is sort of interesting, right? That maybe we don't have these conversations that revolve around the idea that at some point at our college or university students will get that. Maybe we say at some point in our major, they need to get that. And that I think is good. That I think is a good move. And I'm starting to see more and more seminars pop up, right? One of the ones that was interesting, I'm kind of blank on who did it. I think she's at Boston College. I can't remember her name, but she's now doing a seminar. I think it's called From Pen to LLM, right? And so thinking about, let's just work that into our curricula, right? And say, well, this is a seminar. This is a capstone seminar. I think it's a, capstone first year seminar. And they talk about writing and what it means for thinking, what it means for identity, right? And LLMs are a part of that conversation. And so I'm heartened by that. I'm heartened by these conversations, which are thinking a little bit less about, at some point, our student will gain AI literacy at our college or university, where I'm seeing a hopeful shift from that and more towards at some point in our department, students will get that. Now let's specify where that's going to be. It doesn't have to be in first year writing. It certainly can be. And I've seen versions of that. But for others, maybe once they have those foundational writing courses down, maybe, that Comp 2 course. Yeah, let's have it in there. And so that's the shift that I'm seeing the needle starting to move on that. I think we're so early with it. But depending on the institution and how far they are with their AI strategy and their conversations about AI, I'm starting to see that focus on department level initiatives a bit more and university level initiatives a little bit less. And I think that can be a good thing.
I think you're right that it's still so early in that process that it's not surprising that we don't see it develop further, but it kind of reminds me of what we saw a generation or two ago with writing across the curriculum, communicating across the curriculum, and within disciplines, so that, at my institution, you have certainly a foundational writing class in the first year seminar, but then you need to have writing intensive classes in your discipline. It's required that you have one in your discipline. Same thing with this oral communication class, a speaking intensive class. Do you think that model could work with AI? Do you think we'll get to the point where everybody has some foundational AI literacy that's more generalized? And I don't know that they should wait till their freshman year in college. Hopefully they're getting it a lot earlier, but then we need to develop that understanding of AI literacy or fluency or application within the discipline.
Yeah, I think it is a hopeful way to move. I think that, on the one hand, we need to have these disciplinary conversations about what AI means for blank, for our field, for a domain, whatever it is. But then also we need to break out of those silos. One of the pushes I think that AI gives us is to really think about writing across the curriculum, thinking across the curriculum, whatever that is, however we want to frame it. I think that is a hopeful move for this technology, and we should move in that direction. And one of the things that I'm increasingly convinced of is that we need to think of AI as a push, not the focus. And so we can think about how to break out of those silos. And at the same time, I think we have to be aware that for years, decades, we've created this visceral reaction in writing departments. And I think that one of the things that's happened is the writing departments kind of, when you had something new happen, you threw it at them, right? You said, you got to be you, right? We did this with things like public speaking at a lot of institutions. Someone has to teach public speaking. Who's going to do it? Writing, right? You're going to do it. You just kind of threw topic after topic after topic.
It's the catch-all. Yeah.
It's the catch-all. And so I think that we shouldn't be surprised when we come in and say, all right, you're also going to do AI. Well, no, we took on all these other things, right? And, some of them are connected to writing, or you can connect to writing, and some it's kind of hard to do. And I think that we need to be prepared for that. At the same time, we need to be ready to make this argument to say that, we need that formula. We need that kind of model, right? And you're right. We have it with writing across the curriculum. Depending on the institution, maybe there is a way to revamp that approach to thinking about AI, because we have to, and this is a paradox of it all. We need to have disciplinary conversations about AI in some way, and then that also requires cutting across disciplines, right? Saying, well, I'm taking this lens now. What does it look like in writing studies? Let's shift. What does that look like for chemistry? And as we do that, we need to be aware of what form of AI we are talking about. Because we tend to, even now focus on generative AI, but then as we shift, we need to think about, are we still talking about generative AI? Are we talking about other forms of AI? And I've been reading Emily Bender's book about the AI hype cycle. And one of the points that she makes, that I think is so interesting, is that AI is not really a thing. It's kind of this catch-all term that has all these different forms of it.
Right. Yeah.
And it's almost hard to talk about AI. And we need to be aware of that. If we're going to have, these conversations across domains, we have to be aware of, are we shifting the definition of it? There are so many different forms of AI, right? You have LLMs, you have predictive AI, you have all these different things. And trying to be aware, if we're going to take that writing across curriculum approach, being aware of what happens when we start to shift that definition around or expand that definition around.
Yeah, I think as that conversation matures, I think we're obviously going to have some growing pains in figuring out where that applies. But this gives some ideas for us to kind of think about if we're looking at curricular reform. The hard part, of course, is that when we think about gen ed reform or curricular reform, that happens over years, sometimes decades, and this is all changing so rapidly. Which brings me to another thing that Steph and I talked about. We both really love the way that you experiment with your courses. You're always trying new things. You're very open about that and sharing with it. Tell us about some of the ideas or things that you've tried that worked or maybe didn't work so well.
Yeah, one of the things that I've tried to commit myself to, especially the last few years, is just thinking out loud, tinkering out loud, teaching out loud. And that has allowed me to kind of co-design with my students. And I will tell them straight up, right? As with them, try I'm going to experiment things. It's not all going to work. And from students too, it's not all going to work. And I want us to embrace that. And so one of the experiments I've been running for the last couple of years is trying to figure out how to have a process-focused classroom. And so in my classes, I do not teach one and done products in writing. These are part of our culture, being able to just say, all right, hand me a 5-page paper about blank. At the end of it all, I'm going to judge it based off of quality. I do not do that. Instead, I create process clusters. And so I'll, walk them through depending on the course, I might give them a scaffold for a series of steps. More often than not, I give students the chance to design their own steps. If you are going and writing a paper or creating a project, what works for me as a process doesn't necessarily work for you, doesn't necessarily work for, the other person. One of my formative experiences as a student was in high school. I was told you have to write blank, and this is how you're going to do it. You're going to outline. Then you're going to write a thesis statement. Then you're going to do da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I hate outlines. I abhor them with all of my being. Even in high school, I said, I can't do an outline until I write a draft, at least until I have something on the page. And how am I supposed to have a thesis statement before I write the paper? No, I'm going to write the intro at the end. And right, so I had this process thrust upon me. And so the failure. So one of the things I did this past year was, try to figure out what that process cluster is going to be like. And so I became a victim to what I call product bloat. So basically what happened was I had students do this, then this. So, they created a project, they created a process. I asked them to create, anything that they created along the way, whatever it is, outline. I asked them to throw into a sandbox. And then I took a step back and I had 9 different steps in that process cluster. 9. And it was too much. It was too much. And I talked to my students halfway through and we had a conversation about it. Right. And I said, all right, was that too much? And they said, yeah, it started to feel like we were just doing this. And it's like, all right, so we're going to take a step back for the final, help me redesign it. Right. Help me do it.
Great.
Based off of your experience, what can we do with this? And they said, all right, we're going to keep the project. We're going to keep the process. We're going to get rid of the sandbox because that didn't work out well for a lot of us. Instead, we're going to do blank, right? And they said, all right, so we're going to take some of the things that were lost in those initial steps. And I have students doing a transparency statement at the end, regardless of how much AI they used, right? Doesn't matter if they used it, didn't use it. And I use Leon Furtz's scale. So, very simple, a 1 for no AI and a 5 full on AI. And I don't use it in a prescriptive way. I use it in a descriptive way. So students might say, well, I created an outline. I used ChatGPT to help me out. It's a 2. Here's why it's a 2. And so we took some of the things that, we lost because we cut it down from 9 to 4 or whatever it was. And they said, well, maybe we can do that in the transparency statement, right? And so we actually designed it together. And so at the end, we had a process cluster that was much trimmer that we co-designed. And I think that, made it clear all along the way what the process was of each one. Because I think it's very easy when we teach process to just teach more and more mini products, because how can we not? It's impossible to avoid just giving more mini products, reflections, transparency statements, outlines. Those are all, we can kind of infer process from them, but they're all products. They're handed to you, right? And so that was something where I just felt like my original stab at creating a process cluster just didn't work. And my students were a godsend, right? Being able to say, talk to me about your experience. Let's build this together. It allowed me to honestly do it probably 10 times faster than I could if I just thought, well, what are some problems that could have happened, right? I had the benefit of, having 10 plus students in a room with me who just went through this. Like, let's build it. And I think there's also the IKEA effect too, from their perspective, that they helped build something. So now, there's more of an investment as opposed to just creating something that I created 5 years ago and just handed it to them. And that has helped me too think about how to co-design, how to work with students, how to actually give them impact, allow them to have impact within the course. One of the maddening things for me as a student was I often felt like no matter what I did, I couldn't impact the course itself. There's nothing I could have done to redirect the course, to change the course, right? And so I try to create spaces And this is me kind of learning from this experience where I give students more and more impact over the shape of the course itself, because I think that that's going to create buy-in in a way that we never can if I just say, well, here are the 9 things you need to send to me or whatever it is. I try to resist. I think it's easy to fall victim to that because we all have to teach, X number of courses, X number of students, and need to be mindful of that. But where I can, I try to give students as much space for impact and much agency as I possibly can, an agency that has ripple effects within the course. Yeah, but that's what I learned from that failure of suddenly turning a single assignment into 9 assignments.
We could all be so lucky to have such a quote unquote failure, because that really turned into a great experience, I think, for you and the students. And what I like the way you're framing here is that it's kind of like thinking about engaging with media. You could either just be a passive recipient, and if you have a student that's just going through, and if the instructor really has no idea what that student is doing other than whatever they turn in at the end, then that student's just been a passive receiver of the content. But that level of engagement is incredibly important. I want to ask a follow-up about this idea of letting students pick their own kind of scaffolding or almost choose your own adventure. One of the best experiences I had as an undergraduate was with a professor that let us each make a pitch, a little contract that we'd sign with him about how we'd like to be graded that semester. If we really like class discussion, that could be a bigger part of it, or we could just have it all on. He said, if you want a quiz, I'll write a quiz or a test for you. If you want to write a paper, I'll let you do that. Find what's going to be best for you to demonstrate, what you've been able to do in the class. I love that you're employing something like that, giving them these options. What's been the most surprising choice a student has made when given that kind of agency?
Yeah, and I did something similar. I don't call it a grading contract anymore because it has like a weird feel to me. Because one of the other experiments I'm running is alternative assessment. So not giving student percentages, not giving them grades, just basically giving them, completes and incompletes all along the way. And last year I did this as a grading contract. And it was a contract that my approach last semester was to create it, show it to students, and constantly renegotiate it. And one of the things that surprised me was the way that I set it last year. I don't do it anymore because of me co-designing with students. But I said, for our grading contract, there's a baseline. If you do da-da-da-da-da-da, you get a B. And I said, well, to get a B plus, what you have to do, you have to hit those things, and then you have to do some passion project, right? Yeah. Something related to the course. It can be a presentation. It can be a dialogue with me. It can be something written, right? Whatever it is, you get to design it, you get to do it. And then, to get an A, you need to do 2 passion projects. And so one of the things that surprised me when I gave them the ability to negotiate was they always left those passion products undone. Sorry. They left them unchanged. Okay, so they basically didn't negotiate that part. They negotiated the other ones in terms of, what they had to do to get a B and things like that. And it got to about week 12 and no one had done a passion project yet. I hadn't gotten one pitch. I hadn't had one discussion. Yeah. And so I remember bringing my students in and just saying, what's going on? Can you talk to me about this? We haven't done those things yet. And what surprised me was that in 2 of my classes where I had this, none of them had done any of the passion projects, but they didn't want to negotiate them. They wanted them on the grading contract. So we had a conversation about it. And what we ended up doing, in co-designing it was, and maybe this is another failure that I tried to repurpose into a success, was we talked about that. And they talked about how they didn't like that getting a B plus or getting an A required something additional. They felt like doing all of the things that were built within the class, especially because this is what they told me, there's agency built into the assignments. They felt like that was too much of a push. And so we ended up reworking the contract, right? And I came up with a much simpler one for this year. And so that's one of the things that surprised me, that even though we were negotiating all along the way. Even though I gave them spaces to talk, spaces of agency, they felt like they couldn't come in and make that big a change to the course until it was so late in the semester. We talked about, things are done in a couple of weeks. What's going on here? And they needed that additional, they needed me to signal that we can have those conversations. And that's something that maybe I would change early on. I mean, now I've gotten rid of those projects completely and I have a slightly different system. But I think that I'm constantly surprised, maybe I shouldn't be, by the fact that no matter what I do, to a certain extent, I'm a political person. Political not in the sense of
Yeah.
Republican and Democrat, but I'm a person with power in the classroom. I'm still going to be a professor. I'm still going to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And I have to become okay with that and recognize that, I can say, all right, be open with me. Talk me out your experiences. I still can't fully do that because of who I am. And because at the end of a term, I can talk about alternative assessment as much as I want. I can talk about co-design as much as I want. But at least today, I have to submit A, B, C, D, F, right? I still have to do that. And so as long as I have that, I still have that position of power. And so I'm trying to do a better job coming to terms with that because it's something that at least right now today, I can't change.
That's a hard one. Yeah. I mean, that's something I think everybody grapples with, especially if they're trying to decenter that power. You just have to be honest about it. And there's only so far you can go with the hello, fellow kids, right? I mean, you're still the separate, the power in the power position, the authority in the classroom. And so even when you give them, I've had that experience. Well, I'm open to doing X or Z. And they're like, yeah, but what does Anand really want? Is he trying to trick us here? Is he really going to be okay with that? And it's hard to get beyond that. I can't fault them because that's what they've always been conditioned to understand. And it's good for them to recognize those power differential and what that experience is like.
I had a very interesting conversation with the student last year, which I truly, truly appreciated. So it was that part of the semester where I basically created a project that they were working on. And it was, very project-based learning. And as they did that, I pulled students aside for, one-on-one conferences. And I talked to a student and we talked about, how they were doing with the course, everything like that. And at one point we talked about, grading. And he said to me, very, very honestly, he said, I've been in formal schooling for 12 plus years. Yeah. There is nothing you can do to take my focus away from grading, right? And I appreciated that, right? Yeah. And this is what it means to be in a system that I have my students for 15 weeks, have them for, 3+ months. And I can't just completely change the assumptions that are brought to education, right? That have been built up over years and years and years, right? Students have been in formal education, right? They went in there when they were 5 and they're getting out when they're 18 and they have all of this conditioning that is working against me. And I can't completely have anyone unlearn that. I haven't unlearned that, right? I certainly can't ask the students to unlearn that in 3 months. And so I said to the student, I totally get that. And they said, it's about pride, right? I get pride out of getting an A. And so what he ended up talking about was, okay, cool. So what we're going to do is we're not going to, work against that focus. We're going to realign the grade around skills. And this allowed me to actually, come back to my students and give them an idea. About halfway through the semester, I said, all right, we have our grading contract. What if we changed it? What if we said, here are the 4 core skills are already there, right? Collaborating, managing a writing process, communicating, and I think self-assessing. Right? These are the 4 skills, right? So what if we everything is already under those skills. What if we just said, it's all skill-based, right? So if you master 1 skill, it's a D, 2 skills is a C, 3 skills is a B, 4 skills is an A. And so that was in response to that student saying that, maybe the best thing we can do is take the grading. We can't completely take focus away from them, but realign it around the learning, as opposed to just like guessing what I want from you. So that was helpful to me to have that conversation. I'm very grateful to that student that they felt like they could talk to me in that context. Yeah. And it also just really reinforced to me that when we're within a system like this, we all want to break things, right? And I think that for me, at least, my personal journey has been trying to come to terms with the fact that I can only control certain things. And when we've been conditioned to think about education in a certain way, yes, I want to poke at that. I want to problematize that. But I might not be able to completely change it over a course of 3 months. And it's kind of, I'm still going to try, right? I'm still going to tilt at windmills if I need to. But I need to recognize that, hey, that's a big lift. And I want to be all hoorah, hoorah, let's completely dismantle things. But it's hard to do that when we have all these cultural assumptions that are built into education.
Yeah, of course. We have to be realistic about that. Of course. One thing you've also posted about and you've mentioned here also is that you've really made a move into project-based learning and even incorporating debate. And you and I have talked a little bit about this and your plans for this semester. Tell us what you plan on trying out this semester. What are you thinking about doing with debate and project-based learning in your classes?
So what I'm trying to do this semester, and I'm working it out in my writing and research. So this is our Comp 1 class. Is what I'm effectively doing is I'm splitting the semester in half. So the first, really just focusing on two genres. The first genre is personal writing. And so we have, different things. It's really a focus on just reading closely, coming into our own voice, all that sort of stuff. And then, in the second half, we're going to really focus on argumentation and debate. Now, we're not only going to do that in the second half. I've already started to, for this coming week, we'll be doing debates in the classroom and working on evidence, working on reading, all that sort of stuff. And so what I'm trying to figure out now is what topics we want to think about, or how I'm going to, because I want to, in that second half of the semester, especially, what's I think is going to effectively happen is that students will have their own topic to do a deep dive into, right? Though, and we're gonna create a process cluster around this. And so one of the things I want to do is I want to talk about. I don't want to isolate writing. I think that's one of the problems that we run into with writing studies and with Comp 1. We just focus on the writing, but I actually want to focus on the relationship between writing, between speaking, between other forms of communication. And so in that second half of the course, where we're really going to focus on argumentation and debate, students are going to do various things when they're writing about a topic, researching about a topic, and then, performing in a debate or a presentation about that topic. And that's what I want to lean into, because I think that one of the directions I've moved in my classes is when students are in class. And I talked to my students last week about this, and some of them were a little shocked. I'm not going to lecture. I won't do it, especially because now we're so used when we have lecture style learning. Hey, it's YouTube, right? Or it's a video. Yeah. And when we are in class, we are going to focus on human to human connection. We're going to focus on problem solving. We're going to focus on different perspectives. We're going to focus on collaborating and working together. And so in a weird way, not that I really designed it this way, what this sort of has meant for me is that for a lot of the online stuff, they can be very AI powered, right? Students are engaging with debate bots and everything else. And then I didn't really mean for this, but sort of created not an AI free space, but a space where, maybe we're not using technology that much, or we're using it for bits and pieces, but it's all about the person in front of you having that different perspective. And that's one of the things that really interests me about debate. That so much of it is a performance, so much of it is about synthesizing information, regardless of where that information came from. One of the real shocking things for my students is when I ask them, and I did this last semester as a kind of pilot in my literature class, and now I'm kind of generalizing in my Comp 1 class. But when I told students, here's an idea, right? Here's a statement. Half of you are going to agree, half of you are going to disagree. And I said to them, find the evidence however you want. I don't care. Go on your phones, go on the internet, right? Use your personal experience. I don't care. But at the end, you are going to have to synthesize that argument. Yeah. And I think that initial move of just saying whatever tool you think, right? I'll ask them about the tool because that's kind of focusing on process, but that they could use those things. They can, as long as they were being responsible with it, they can use ChatGPT, Claude, things like that. But what mattered was that they could collaborate, they could come up with that perspective. And I felt like I could observe those things happening. And that's one of the things that, after I did that pilot a few times last semester, that's why I think debate would be really, really helpful, because it gets them to do that synthesis, gets them to think about the other perspective. And also has kind of a competitive aspect to it too, right? Which isn't a bad thing to get that sort of buy-in. So that's what I'm playing with now, just trying to figure out, what that communal debate's going to be like at the end, because I want that and having that sort of shared topic, but also giving students, especially in their writing and presenting along the way, the ability to research what it would mean like to debate X, something that is a little bit more closely aligned with them. And so it's going to be a matter of trying to figure out, how to have those two things, how to juggle those two things, and how to focus on, for students, the relationship between how we write, how we speak, and other forms that we communicate.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm really excited to hear how that goes for you. I'm teaching argumentation this semester too, and as I mentioned, always revising it and thinking about it. What I really like about this model is that it puts the emphasis back on that human interaction, and it underscores the importance of these critical thinking skills in synthesis, communication, interaction, collaboration, that it also tells the students, and I'm approaching it the same way, I want to show you how to use the AI tools to get ready for the debates and be totally ready. I want you to be, up to your eyeballs in evidence, right? And I want to have every line of argument possibly ready. but then you've got to be able to do something with it. And you have to be able to demonstrate that you understand those lines of argument. And it's a great model for students to see, okay, there are limits to what AI can actually do for you with your human interaction, and it can better prepare you if you use it responsibly. But if I just had it write a speech for me and I read it, what am I going to do after that? So I'm excited to see what you have. Would you come back maybe at the end of the semester and we could talk about it and compare notes and hear how it went for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's something that I'm trying to get better at, and debate is my way of thinking about that. Once we've created something, once we've created a written artifact, whether it was just us, whether it was done through a human AI collaboration, what do we do with it? Like, how do we actually bring it into the world? How do we take it off the screen, off the page, and present, debate, and actually use it as a jumping off point for human to human connection? And that's the big push for me. That's what students of mine just haven't really had that much practice with, right? Because it tends to be handed in, you get X grade, and odds are, more often than not, you throw that paper away because you got a 93 or 83 or whatever. But just like trying to figure out like what the afterlife is of that product. But yeah, I'm thinking through it. But yes, I'd love to come and talk about it and talk about probably ways that I've failed and hopefully ways that I grew through the process. It's very much a work in progress.
It is. It's just an ongoing process. I love that. It's not just about the product. You don't just produce a product that you have in a debate. That just starts another process. And I think that's a great model for the students. Jason, you've been so generous with your time, and I know we're running out of time now. So I have one last question I wanted to ask you about. You posted recently a thought that you think maybe higher ed and others agree with you, maybe facing a relevance crisis in 2026. If you were the president of a college, let's say, what's one thing that you would do? Maybe is it something you would abolish, some traditional element of the university that you would abolish or that you would change so that the institution remains relevant? Where do we go from here?
I think that the biggest thing would be to make it clear about how important the why is of what we do, right? Look at that mission statement. Look at other parts of your institutional culture and try to say, is this actually making our relevance clear? Is it actually getting it across? And sometimes I think yes. Right, it's clear what that institution, what role that institution is playing. And try to expand it. Don't just focus on getting students ready for a career. I think that's certainly part of it. We need to hit that, but also just with personal fulfillment, right? And just how it's about getting students to follow their passions, actually get interested in something and focus on just being lifelong learners, critical thinking, whatever it is. So I think step number one is kind of look at the institutional culture and mission statement and everything else with that, and just make that relevance known. Because one of the things that I think is happening is, well, I think there's a lot happening, but for one, people are questioning whether college education is worth it, right? I'm putting X amount of money in it, and what am I getting out of it? And then, we need to get faculty on board to try to figure out, once we have that conversation about what we're doing as an institution, like why we are actually there, what we offer students, then trying to figure out how that goes down the line. If we just have faculty members who are glorified graders, does that actually serve that? What role does faculty actually create in mentorship? And I don't take away from institutions who do this. We had a model like this too, right? Up until relatively recently, faculty members, if you were teaching online, you were handed the course. You were handed a blueprint. You couldn't actually change it. So you're just grading. You are just assessing, right? You're not actually changing anything in there. You're not adding videos. You're not doing everything like that. We need to think about what sort of message that sends. Same thing with auto graders and AI graders, right? Well, what does that do for us, right? So I think that a lot of it is thinking about purpose, talking to faculty about it, talking to students about it. And hey, one of the biggest things I think we need to do a better job doing, talk to students, talk to them all the time. Don't just send them a survey once a year about their experience at your institutions. Please do not do that. Really get to know them. Give them spaces where they can affect things. Okay, it's about impact. One of the things that I've been trying to do is, try to make a space where, you have a committee. Cool. Why isn't a student on it? Let's put a student on it. Let's see what happens. That kind of experimentation, saying, put a student on the committee, see how it goes. I think it's actually going to go pretty well. I think that it feels it's kind of unnerving, but really don't just talk to students. Give students the ability to start to shape your institution, right? Shape your courses, shape your approach. I don't think we use our proximity to students nearly enough. right? In what other context do you have, say, 5,000, 10,000, 30,000 students that you can just like talk to? You can just like see, you can have conversations with. Not just a survey. It's not enough. So yeah, those would be the big things for me, making that why really, really clear, top down, and giving students the ability to shape as opposed to just, asking their survey every year and going from there, which I just don't think is enough. I think we need to get them in positions where they can have impact within the college and outside the college.
And given the examples that you've provided in the last hour, that gives a lot of credibility that you don't just talk this talk, you're actually walking it. You are listening to students, and the way you're sharing that with all of us to help shape this broader discussion is really noteworthy. And thank you for that. For anybody that doesn't already follow you, how can they find you? How can they learn more about your work?
So I'm most active on LinkedIn. I try to post every day or so, sometimes more if I just have a thought that occurs to me. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So people can follow me there, DM me there. I also have a Substack that people can find. So the AI Adventure. So I try to think about, AI and what it means for the classroom, what it means for connection, all sorts of stuff. I try to be big with it. So those are the two places I'm most active, and people are always welcome to message me there and chat, 'cause I know that this is complicated and difficult. So if you are listening to this and you want to reach out, please reach out to me. I try to be somewhat personable and talk to as many people as I can.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to hold you to that at the end of the semester. I'd love to have you back and really want to hear about that course and compare some notes. I always learn so much from your posts and learned a lot this hour. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.